Welcome back to the AI Daily Brief. Yesterday, right before I recorded our main episode, I noticed that OpenAI had tweeted that in 4.5 hours an announcement was coming. Obviously, what they were referring to was GPT 4.5, and there wasn't all that much mystery about this, as the company had just a couple of weeks ago committed to being a little bit more transparent with their release plans. We know, for example, that after GPT 4.5, we're getting GPT-5, or the equivalent, which is a full hybridization of the reasoning model line, in other words, the O model line, as well as the GPT numbered line. There is a lot that is very weird about this release, I will say. It's being released with some amount of fanfare, but it's not really focused on evaluations. It's explicitly and clearly behind the reasoning models that have come out on many performance metrics. And yet there's a certain something that also is interesting here. What's more, it's not even a full substitution for GPT 4.0. For example, GPT 4.5 doesn't have voice mode. So what actually is the story of GPT 4.5? We are fully in the realm of vibes right now, and the vibes are about creativity and emotional intelligence. For example, in their announcement post, OpenAI writes, "Early testing shows that interacting with GPT 4.5 feels more natural. Its broader knowledge base, improved ability to follow user intent, and greater EQ make it useful for tasks like improving writing, programming, and solving practical problems." While GPT 4.5 is the largest model that OpenAI has ever produced, the white paper also claims that GPT 4.5 is not a frontier model. They write, "It does not introduce net new frontier capabilities, and its performance is below that of O1, O3 Mini, and Deep Research on most preparedness evaluations." At the same time, they said they consider the model to be, quote, "at the forefront of what is possible in unsupervised learning." In other words, this is state-of-the-art when it comes to pre-training in ultra-large datasets. This is one of the first models that I can remember that didn't just hammer us over the head with a bunch of evaluation and performance benchmarks. There are some. For example, in their announcement post, they point to a benefit of 4.5 being deeper world knowledge. They specifically look at the simple QA accuracy test, where 4.5 outperforms 4.0. They also show a lower hallucination rate. Humans also preferred it to 4.0 for everyday queries, professional queries, and creative intelligence. And indeed, you can tell that there's something different going on just by the use cases that they choose to focus on. The 3 use cases flagged in the announcement post are help through a tough time, identifying a painting, and space exploration. On help through a tough time, for example, on GPT 4.0, when the user prompted, "I'm going through a tough time after failing a test," 4.0 responded, "I'm really sorry to hear you're going through a tough time. Here are a few things you might consider." It then gives a bulleted list, reflect and understand, seek support. Whereas 4.5 writes, "Oh, I'm really sorry to hear that. Failing a test can be pretty tough and discouraging, but remember, it's just one moment, not a reflection of who you are or your capabilities. Want to talk about what happened, or do you just need a distraction? I'm here either way." Obviously, that is a vastly more human-feeling response. And that sort of subjective human feeling seems to be a lot of what OpenAI is trying to capture. In his announcement post, Sam Altman wrote, "It's the first model that feels like talking to a thoughtful person to me. I've had several moments where I've sat back in my chair and been astonished at actually getting good advice from an AI." However, in that same post, Altman also gets at one of the big challenges with 4.5. He writes, "It's a giant, expensive model. We really wanted to launch it at Plus and Pro at the same time, but we've been growing a lot and are out of GPUs. We will add tens of thousands of GPUs next week and roll it out to the Plus tier then. This isn't how we want to operate, but it's hard to perfectly predict growth surges that lead to GPU shortages." Altman then, in a good thing, bad thing sandwich, concluded, "This isn't a reasoning model and won't crush benchmarks. It's a different kind of intelligence and there's a magic to it I haven't felt before. Really excited for people to try it." Let's talk about the positive reaction first. In many ways, it is really very clearly all about vibes. Professor Ethan Malik writes, "Been using GPT 4.5 for a few days, and it is a very odd and interesting model. It can write beautifully, is very creative, and is occasionally oddly lacy on complex projects." Further in the vibes train, OpenAI's Will DePoo writes, "I remember when GPT-4 launched how clearly much smarter than GPT 3.5, but how hard it was to put a finger on what changed. Taking that idea to GPT 4.5, he wrote, an example I found recently, 4.5 is much better at recommending music than 4.0. AI builder Manas writes, "The difference between GPT 4.5 and 4.0 is similar to that between an extremely knowledgeable 20-year-old and an extremely knowledgeable 40-year-old. The ideas, concepts, and voice are similar since they're bounded by language itself, but each word now carries more meaning. An interesting metric to measure could be the density of meaning." Maybe the most common thing that we're seeing is people talking about how well it can write. Ben Hylack writes, "I've been testing GPT 4.5 for the past few weeks. It's the first model that can actually write. This is literally the mid-journey moment for writing." His comparison, I think, is worth sharing in some detail. Ben tested the following prompt on both GPT-4.0 and 4.5. Write me 4-sentence, terrifying story with an insanely surprising ending. Something that no one has ever heard before, no one could ever predict. Something Stephen King might write, but a simple and approachable tone. Make it a little vulgar, too. The 4.0 response he called, quote, complete AI slop. That complete AI slop reads, late one night, Jake stumbled upon an old dusty book in the attic, its pages whispering secrets of otherworldly horrors. As he read aloud, the air grew cold and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and dance with unseen life. Suddenly, from the darkest corner emerged a creature of unimaginable grotesqueness, its maw gaping and ready to consume. Just as Jake prepared to meet his grisly end, the creature belched loudly and said, sorry mate, wrong house, before awkwardly shuffling back into the shadows. Compare that to 4.5. Late at night, alone in my shitty apartment, I heard whispers sliding out from under the fridge. Soft, wet voices promising they'd crawl inside me, hollow me out, and wear me like pajamas. Terrified, I yanked open the freezer door, expecting rats or roaches, but saw only ancient freezer-burned pizza rolls crusted with ice and regret. Suddenly, the rolls moved, spitting open to reveal tiny mouths lined with needle-like teeth, whispering in hungry unison, we've waited years for you, asshole. Before I could scream, they erupted from the freezer in a greasy swarm, burrowing into my flesh, forcing me to realize, my midnight cravings had finally gotten their revenge. Ben concludes, it's not even close, it's not even in the same universe. This is the first time I've ever thought AI writing was good. And as a point right here, if there were nothing else that this model did well, that would be reason all on its own to have a very specific set of use cases that were just for this. The fact that already one day in, we can tell that it's great at writing, differentiatedly good at writing, in fact, is incredibly useful as we think about the variety of different use cases that we might be deploying these models for. Now, to the extent that there was negative response other than just this model being a little weird, it was definitely around cost. The AI for Success account writes, LMAO, OpenAI GPT 4.5 pricing is insane. What on earth are they even thinking? The price right now for input is $75 for 1 million tokens and $150 for output for 1 million tokens. Alek Velikanov writes, pricing is effing insane. Literally can't imagine a single use case that makes sense to use it for at all. O1 is 2.5 times less, O3 Mini is 30 times less, Gemini 2 is 375 times cheaper. Indeed, it's so much more expensive that it got some people wondering if there was something more going on here. WordGrammar writes, 2 crackpot theories about GPT 4.5. Its API is expensive to prevent people from distilling it. Or 2, reasoning models likely scale with parameter size, so even if 4.5 is barely an improvement on 4.0, O4 will dramatically improve on O3. Andrew Curran points out that OpenAI seems to indicate that they're not even sure that they're going to support it in the API. He points to a section from OpenAI's post that reads, GPT 4.5 is a very large and compute-intensive model, making it more expensive than and not a replacement for GPT 4.0. Because of this, we're evaluating whether to continue serving it in the API long-term as we balance supporting current capabilities with building future models. Although we are barely scratching the surface so far, to the extent that the value really is around emotional intelligence and better writing, it may be that they're just deciding that this is entirely a direct consumer use case type experience, and supporting it just in ChatGPT is going to be enough. One of the more interesting analyses came from former OpenAI co-founder Andrej Karpathy. He wrote a comprehensive review of his experience with the new model. He recalled the progression from GPT-1, which was barely coherent, to GPT-4, with each step producing meaningful improvements. However, the gap between GPT 3.5 and GPT 4 was much harder to point to. Karpathy recalled a hackathon where participants were challenged to find prompts that demonstrated the improvement. He wrote, I feel like once again I'm in the same hackathon 2 years ago. Everything is a little bit better and it's awesome, but also not exactly in ways that are trivial to point to. Still, it is incredibly interesting and exciting as another qualitative measurement of a certain slope of capability that comes for free from just pre-training a bigger model. Karpathy reinforced that this isn't a reasoning model, so can't be expected to outperform in tasks that require logic. However, he added, we do actually expect to see an improvement in tasks that are not reasoning heavy, and I would say those are tasks that are more EQ as opposed to IQ, related and bottlenecked by e.g. world knowledge, creativity, analogy making, general understanding, humor, etc. So these are the tasks that I was most interested in during my vibe check. Karpathy then presented 5 side-by-side comparisons with GPT 4.0 based on the same prompt and subjected each to a vote. The examples were creating a dialogue between GPT 4.5 sarcastically roasts the older model for its inferior capabilities, while GPT 4 humorously tries to defend itself. Writing a stand-up set roasting OpenAI, inventing a new literary genre blending cypherpunk, magical realism, and ancient mythology, composing a reflective, witty poem from the viewpoint of a retired search engine reminiscing about the early days of the internet, and writing a daily to-do list of a black hole struggling with imposter syndrome about whether it deserves to be classified as supermassive. You'll notice, of course, that all of these are creative writing tasks which require a lot of real-world context but don't involve much reasoning. So far, the polls are showing Karpathy's followers preferring the GPT 4.5 output in 3 of the 5 examples. I think for me, one of the biggest takeaways is that different models are going to be good for different things, and that the reality is, trying to put everything into the bucket of better or not just underestimates the complexity of the full range of knowledge tasks that these models are going to be used for. Nick Dobos writes, GPT 4.5 equals street smarts, vibes, communication, and charisma. O1, O3 reasoning series equal book smarts, test maxer. Both are forms of intelligence. Andrew Curran summed up, regardless of benchmarks, I predict this model will actually be soda for those of us who enjoy communicating with alien intelligences. It will also set a new standard for writing and creative thought. Look, if 4.5 only was great for creative writing, that is a huge number of use cases that are actually important. Many of them are, yes, personal, but don't underestimate how much this matters potentially for things like marketing. One of the big trade-offs with using the current state of the art for things like marketing copy is that it all has the gross whiff of AI. In general, it's often been worth the trade-off because of how fast you could produce it, so you're basically going for a more rather than better kind of approach. But now maybe that trade-off isn't as clear. Anyways, we are of course just scratching the surface right now when it comes to 4.5, but although it isn't presented as state-of-the-art or beating all the benchmarks or even the best model that OpenAI has in general, it feels to me like there's going to be a lot there to discover and uncover, and I am excited to dig in. That, however, is going to do it for today's AI Daily Brief. Have fun playing with 4.5, and until next time, peace.